This is a slightly edited version of my Google review for our experience at Bronson Hospital, which I feel needs to have a little bit more attention on. As of reading this off, the review is not viewable online to anyone but myself, I believe, and that's really scummy. So let's start. My wife and I went to be induced, and on the 29th our son was born. We went in on the 27th. During that whole time period, we had 2 good nurses during the whole experience, not accounting for the student nurses who were very nice, or the doctors and practitioners and anesthesiologists, which we maybe only saw once or twice. This is going to be a bit lengthy, but I recommend hearing this whole thing out before you consider going to Bronson to have your child. Getting in on the 27th and for the first 15 hours, everything was pretty smooth. My wife is autistic and has an anxiety disorder, so there was a point where she was nonverbal. I was signed on to give the okay for pain meds or surgeries, otherwise necessary in such a case, of which she was in a lot of pain and panicking. I gave the okay for pain meds. The nurse we had in for the night shift in labor and delivery told me this had to be my wife's choice, even though she had went nonverbal at that point. Literally 2 hours later, with them coming in for regular therapy, I guess that's the best I can call it, sessions, off and on, my wife was finally verbal again and had to be coerced into taking pain meds and trying another medicine to induce labor. It has now been 19 hours. The shifts change in 5 hours. We spend most of the time just waiting. During this time, we get some food. Some folk come in for my wife's blood tests due to her having preeclampsia, and are astounded to find her vasoconstricting, and it takes around 5 needle pokes to actually get any blood out. Once more, because she is panicking. I explain this is a regular thing. They do this same thing twice more before realizing they should stop, as it is only making the situation significantly worse for her, even after it was explained to them time and time again. It is at this point in the review that I feel the need to mention both myself and my wife have degrees of medical backgrounds, though I will admit mine is more secondhand than hers due to my family history. Every single time through the whole process when we expressed medical knowledge, the nurses or doctors were upset with us for knowing the necessary information ahead of time or being informed, and took some kind of direct offense as if we were telling them to not do their jobs. This comes up later as well. There were a good number of times where information they gave us was just straight up wrong. One of my friends gave me an amazing quote I feel is applicable here. "Stupid people often hate being in the room with those smarter than them." And I make no claim to be a genius or the smartest person in the room at that time. I think that goes to my wife. But the night shift nurse on the 28th and the 29th, whilst my wife was actively in labor, told my wife she could just not have contractions and hold back if she tried enough. This is complete bullshit in my wife's situation. You see, the day shift nurse had given her way too much of a hormone to induce labor. We were both too tired to realize, and when the night shift nurse thankfully corrected it, my wife went into labor about an hour later. Nonetheless, you shouldn't tell a woman in active labor having involuntary contractions, a completely normal thing, and happens very often from our knowledge, from my knowledge specifically, that she can just not have contractions or have more control over herself to do so. This nurse also regularly yelled at me to not yell at my wife. While yelling at my wife, all I was doing is holding her hand, holding her leg up to help with labor in spite of my back problems, putting me in horrible pain, and finally just being as supportive as I can. We were both horrifically worn out because every 30 minutes, without fail, the nurses would come in and adjust sittings on various devices and to flip my wife like a burger. I have no ill will towards this. This was necessary for the process. I get why. My wife was in terrible pain, and at one point she begged for death because of this. This is kind of a normal circumstance during birth, but made much worse by the overdose of the hormone used to induce. Speaking of that, and back on topic, the overdose of the hormone is entirely non-fatal, just really bad. So bad my wife's birth was just 54 minutes. A normal birth for a firstborn child is 2 to 8 hours. Even being induced does not make it this quick. The day shift nurse on the 28th is the one that did this. However, she was also our favorite nurse for the procedure because she was just vibrant and very fun. The night shift nurse we had for both nights in labor and delivery was our second favorite, very polite, on point, with everything, genuinely incredibly supportive, aside from the therapy issue and yelling at me sometimes. There was another day shift nurse that came in on the 29th, and I didn't ever catch her name or anything about that, but she would, when asked questions, spout things that weren't at all really relevant or just were complete nonsense. I don't ever remember her saying a correct thing. And now we move on to the mother and baby unit sometime past 9 a.m. on the 29th. Here we transferred to a nice comfy room that, well, felt comfy. With our new baby in tow, of course. He was born 5 pounds, 14 ounces, 19 inches long. From here, the first 12 hours, it went perfectly fine. Once more. Then the night shift nurse came on staff. This is the only nurse on staff I will tell the name of because I absolutely think everyone should be warned of her. I only know her first name, Julia. Do not attack or hurt this woman or seek her out. It's not worth your time. She's an older lady, probably near retirement. She refused to come feed our baby unless 4 hours had passed, without coaxing to do so, even though he regularly needed feeding every 2 hours. At some point on this shift, they must have figured out our baby boy was intolerant to the formula they were giving him and summarily decided to keep giving him the formula. But I digress. That happened on the 30th, not on the 29th when we were told that, but there's no good place to put that in this review. Julia also overfed our child until he started puking all over himself and held him up by his tiny fucking head for 10 seconds to change his diaper. You never hold a baby by their head like this for any reason, especially a newborn. She would grab him by the underside of the jaw and lift him in the air, and just held him there for 10 seconds. I don't know how anyone else in the family has calmed down about this, or my wife, because this still makes me incredibly irate. During this night shift, our baby came down with colic, or colic, however you say it, or maybe it was the abuse, because he screams certainly the amount for colic now, but he regularly screamed for around 15 hours at a time in the hospital. Meaning he screams a lot more than 3 hours a day. That's what colic is. If you're unfamiliar, your baby screams more than 3 hours a day. Not to be confused with purple screaming. The nurses made us feel so bad for this involuntary screaming we considered giving him up for adoption. I'm also irate about this. Of course I am, because that's something to be very irate about, and it's not okay. Around 12 p.m. on the 30th, we were told we'd soon be able to leave and go home. This is a big jump forward in time here, but once Julia was off shift, we had a smooth running and more rational people on staff for the most part. However, the lactation consultant who came by at around 11 a.m. on the 30th made us feel very bad for having information ahead of time on lactation, induction, and those things, even though a nurse earlier on the shift the day before had given us information, and some of it we told her directly. There was a point where the lactation consultant actually gave us information that was contradictory towards inducing lactation and was better for someone already lactating, even though we told her we were inducing it. We took this advice to heart, and we later had to Google it and correct it when we noticed issues with milk flow. The lactation consultant also made us feel very, very bad for our colicky baby, saying that anytime a baby is screaming, it either means they need food or they need to go to a doctor. That is clearly not the case because he has been fed and changed and cared for and held for at least 45 minutes now and burped and all of that, and he is still in the other room screaming because he is colicky. The only time he doesn't do this is when he's in the presence of others. Sometimes he'll just scream in the mornings and we call it his morning scream. I digress once more. We told her everything we knew, and she was very upset that she didn't need to tell us very much. This came back on us when the day shift registered nurse, who was otherwise very kind to us and helped us a lot, got snappy with us before we left. We had to explain to her that we aren't telling people how to do their jobs, as that's the clear impression the lactation consultant got from us. But I kind of want to go back and instead tell them how to do their jobs, knowing information after. And being more well rested. This RN is actually one of the good nurses that we had a good experience with, and we thought was overall a fairly pleasant person to be around until she got snappy. However, I will elaborate more on that later. I think we had 10 to 15 nurses and doctors go in and out. Only 2 of them were actually good and had regular sense. The anesthesiologist and the doctor overseeing the birth we saw maybe once or twice, we're not counting them among these numbers. This means the nurses were talking bad about us to other nurses behind our backs, though. And in certain cases, like the lactation consultant, outright lying to other nurses on shift about events that happened in the hospital room. That is unacceptable. And that would explain why some of the nurses were not happy with us, and the RN that we liked seemed kind of relieved to see us go. At one point, Julia, back on her, took our colicky baby away to allow us to sleep. Looking back on this, I am scared about what she did to him while we weren't looking, if she just holds him by his head for any measure of time to change his diaper. The day shift RN was much kinder, and we trusted her with our baby boy for some hours so we could rest up for the trip home. The trip home was only a few miles away, but nonetheless we were very tired after a very long time, my wife especially so. Now I want to drive home the point once more that we only had 2, maybe 3 good nurses, and only one of them really can stay in the running for that by the end of this review. The one on the 27th and 28th in labor and delivery night shifts, though I put this here pensively, she was a good nurse. She was fun, she was on the point, and she did absolutely everything she could right, for the most part. There was a point in time, as I mentioned above, where she essentially told my wife, "Don't push, I know you can hold back, and if you keep pushing, we'll have to rebuild your cervix, and that's a very bloody, painful, and expensive process." This is paraphrased, it is not exact. The RN for the mom and baby unit, she was incredibly kind. I don't really have any complaints about her. She was negatively influenced by other people that did not tell her the truth, I'm going to presume, or if they did, they spun it in a way that made us seem a lot worse than we were. Because we weren't really bad, we were just very tired. New parents are always very tired. The day shift nurse on the 28th was the most fun, but the overdosing on birth hormone, as told to us by the night shift nurses, not just one of them, but multiple of them, puts her out of the running for being a good nurse. And by the time we finally left, the nurses didn't even sign our release or safety forms for our child seat. I respect this because it could mean that they recognized we were prepared, but I also admonish it because I know that's the protocol and they have to make sure we are prepared. We both had the seat ready to go, though, so that's a thing. I do not ever recommend you go here to have your child. You will be too worn out to realize most of the issues with the staff. As for me, I found out after from a retired nurse in my wife's family that a good few of the nurses there are very sexist and genuinely actively made comments on it that I was too tired to realize during the procedure of everything going on to know. This is likely why I wasn't allowed to speak for my wife, who became nonverbal. The number of comments aimed towards degrading men, the comments that pretty much anything one nurse disliked, was made by some man who didn't understand. This is likely why several nurses yelled at me, whilst I was being kind and supportive to my wife as I could. My wife pointlessly suffered for this reason. I know a lot of men aren't very good at this, empathizing or sympathizing with the process or any of it, and I understand being cautious because of that. But after a while, it just gets really demeaning and cruel, not just to me, but to my wife, who I saw suffering pointlessly, whilst there were therapy sessions held, waiting several hours just to administer something I recognized immediately necessary. There was a point I was asked to sit back and away from my wife while they gave her an epidural because some men pass out because of it. I had to explain past things that had happened to me that weren't fun, being stabbed multiple times, shot at, and hit by a car, though that did not hurt me or cause any significant damage. I did not explain that there, but I figured that would get me a pass to sit next to my wife and comfort her, because she's trypanophobic, which is a terrible fear of needles, and she desperately needs me there. I am not at all afraid of needles, but that allowed me to get up close and sit next to her. In case for some reason this review is taken down, I will be doing a reading of it, which is exactly what I'm doing here. I'm just continuing to read what I have already written, and I encourage people to spread the word to others about this horrendous behavior. But there is good news at the end of all of this. The Bronson Cardiology Unit is amazing. Unfortunately, though, my wife, child, nor I needed heart surgery. Oh, that is such a shame.